My mother switched my baby at the maternity ward 3 years ago because she thought the other one was more handsome. I spent all this time raising another family's baby. My 3-year-old son was peacefully playing with his colored blocks in the living room when my mother uttered the most devastating phrase I've ever heard in my entire existence. Gabriella, I need to tell you something about Pedro. He's not the baby you gave birth to 3 years ago. I switched him at the maternity ward because the other one was more handsome and deserved to have a better life with you. The world literally stopped spinning at that exact moment, on a sunny Thursday afternoon that should have been just another ordinary day in my life as a dedicated mother, competent professional, and daughter who still maintained family ties out of pure social obligation. My mother, Regina, was sitting on the beige sofa in my impeccably decorated living room, drinking her usual 4 o'clock chamomile tea, when she decided to confess the most heinous crime a grandmother could commit against her own daughter and grandson. She had deliberately switched my newborn baby at the maternity ward 3 years earlier, condemning 2 entire families to live devastating lies based on her sick aesthetic preferences about infant appearance. The coffee cup I was holding slipped from my trembling hands and shattered on the white porcelain floor, creating a dark puddle that slowly spread while I remained completely paralyzed, unable to process the magnitude of the revelation that had just instantly destroyed everything I believed to be true about my maternal life for the past 1,095 days. Pedro, the blonde boy with crystal blue eyes, whom I had unconditionally loved since the first second I supposedly held him in the delivery room, who had nursed at my breast during endless sleep-deprived nights, whose first words, first steps, and first smiles I had obsessively documented in thousands of photographs and videos. This boy, who was the absolute center of my emotional universe, was not biologically my son. The child innocently playing a few meters away, completely oblivious to the emotional atomic bomb that had just exploded in the room, was a stranger my mother had stolen from another woman because she considered his physical characteristics superior to those of my true biological son. My 37 years of life, carefully built upon foundations of hard work as a human resources manager at a multinational company, stable marriage with Rafael for 8 years, and especially my identity as a devoted mother who had waited 5 years of unsuccessful attempts and fertility treatments to finally get pregnant. All of this collapsed in a matter of seconds before Regina's casual confession. She remained seated on the sofa with disturbing tranquility, as if she had just confessed to forgetting to buy milk at the supermarket, instead of admitting to having committed a federal crime of kidnapping, forgery, and destruction of fundamental family bonds. Mom, what you're saying can't be true. This is some kind of sick joke, or you're having some episode of mental confusion. I finally managed to articulate with a strangled voice, still desperately hoping that all of this was a grotesque misunderstanding or a nightmare from which I would wake up at any moment. The sound of Pedro's childish voice calling, "Mommy, look at the castle I made," cut through the tense silence of the room like a sharp blade, making me automatically turn toward him with the maternal smile I had practiced thousands of times over the past 3 years, even as my inner world crumbled into irreparable pieces. There he was, the boy I had rocked through countless nights of colic, whose fevers had left me in panic, whose wounds I had kissed to heal, whose developmental achievements I had celebrated with tears of pride. And he did not share a single gene with me. His golden blonde hair like rays of sunshine, his blue eyes that everyone always commented were so different from his parents', his porcelain clear skin that contrasted with the Mediterranean tan that Raphael and I shared. All these characteristics that I had naively attributed to distant recessive genes now made terrible, devastating sense. How could you do this to me, to Raphael, to this innocent child, and especially to his real parents who must have lived through 3 years of agony raising the wrong son? I asked, my voice progressively rising in volume as the magnitude of Regina's crime became increasingly clear in my shocked mind. You stole my biological son from me, stole Pedro from his parents, destroyed 2 entire families because you thought one baby was more beautiful than another? What kind of monster does something like that? Words poured from my mouth in uncontrolled torrents, years of repressed hurt about my mother's controlling and narcissistic behavior, finally finding an outlet through this revelation that confirmed my worst nightmares about her true moral nature. Regina rose from the sofa with the erect and arrogant posture she always maintained when confronted about her inappropriate behaviors over the years. The same posture she used when I was a child, and dared to question her arbitrary and often cruel decisions about my appearance, my friendships, my academic and professional choices. Gabriella, you're being dramatic and ungrateful as you've always been since you were little. she replied with that condescending tone that instantly transported me back to my traumatic childhood under her obsessive psychological control. I did what any loving grandmother would do. I ensured my daughter had the best baby available in the maternity ward at that time, because the other one was scrawny, dark-skinned, and had a crooked nose, while Pedro was perfect like a Renaissance angel. The casualness with which she described having evaluated newborn babies as merchandise in a catalog, choosing the most beautiful as if she were selecting fruit at the supermarket, revealed such profound sociopathy that it made me question every interaction I had ever had with this woman who claimed to be my mother. Are you telling me that you entered the maternity ward, went to the nursery, and physically switched two babies based on your distorted aesthetic preferences about infant appearance? I asked, desperately trying to understand the logistics of the crime, while my brain struggled to process the unthinkable. How was this possible? Where was security? The identification bracelets? The nurses? A disturbing smile formed on Regina's lips as she delighted in reporting the sordid details of her premeditated crime, as if she were sharing the recipe of a particularly successful dish instead of confessing to child abduction. It was easier than you imagined, darling. That early morning, you were unconscious because of the emergency C-section. Raphael had gone out to get some things from home, and I was responsible for taking care of everything. The maternity ward was in chaos because of a highway accident that brought several simultaneous emergencies. The nurses were overloaded, and the nursery had only one sleepy technician looking after 12 babies. I just had to wait for the right moment during the early hours, when she left to get medications, enter the nursery, which didn't have cameras at that time, and make the switch. I cut off the identification bracelet from your baby, put it on Pedro, and vice versa. It took less than 3 minutes and changed the destiny of two families forever. The meticulous way she described the crime, the evident planning, the calculated premeditation of each step, made me realize that this had not been a momentary impulse from an emotionally unstable grandmother, but rather a criminal action carefully executed by someone who had weighed the consequences and decided that it would be worth destroying lives to satisfy her sick aesthetic standards. Regina, do you realize that you committed multiple federal crimes? Kidnapping, document forgery, false identity. You could spend the rest of your life in prison for this, I said, my voice trembling between anger and incredulity. But even as I pronounced these words, part of me still refused to accept that the woman who had raised me, as problematic as our relationship had always been, could be capable of such cruelty. Prison? She laughed with disdain, that dry, humorless laugh I had known so well since childhood, the laugh she always used whenever someone dared to suggest consequences for her actions. Nobody can prove anything after 3 years, darling. It's my word against whom? There are no witnesses, no cameras from that time. The hospital records show that you took home the baby who is registered as Pedro in your name. I'm only telling you this now because my conscience weighs on me. But legally you are and always will be Pedro's mother, just as the other family is legally the parents of. What was the name you had chosen again? Oh yes, Matthias. They are Matthias's parents now, and that's final. The name of my true son being casually pronounced by the mouth of the criminal who had stolen him from me hit me like a punch to the stomach. Matthias. My baby was named Matthias. Raphael and I had spent months discussing names, researching meanings, imagining what it would be like to call our son, until we finally agreed on Matthias, which means gift of God. Ironically appropriate considering the 5 years of attempts and treatments that preceded his conception. And somewhere in this city, a 3-year-old child named Matthias, my biological son, was calling another woman mother, not knowing that his entire life was a lie orchestrated by my psychopathic mother. The unmistakable smell of freshly brewed coffee permeated every corner of our renovated kitchen when Pedro uttered the most devastating words a mother could hear on an apparently ordinary sunny Saturday morning. Mommy, Grandma Regina told me a very big secret yesterday when you were at work. She said I'm not the baby you had in your tummy, that she swapped me with another boy at the maternity ward because I was prettier and deserved to have you as my mom. The world literally stopped spinning at that exact moment, at 9:17 on a morning that should have been just another quiet weekend in our family routine carefully built over 3 years of dedicated motherhood, sleepless nights, obsessively documented first steps, and thousands of precious moments that now revealed themselves to be founded on a monstrous lie orchestrated by my own mother. Pedro was sitting in his favorite blue chair, the one we had bought specially for him when he turned 2 and insisted he wanted to sit like a grown-up at the dinner table. his little feet swinging in the air while he awkwardly held a colorful plastic spoon full of cereal with milk that occasionally dripped onto the Spider-Man pajamas he loved to wear every Saturday morning. His crystal blue eyes that everyone always commented were so different from his parents, stared at me with that devastating innocence of a 3-year-old who had just repeated words whose catastrophic meaning he couldn't comprehend, but which had instantly destroyed every certainty I possessed about my life, my motherhood, my identity as a woman who had fought 5 years against infertility to finally hold a baby in my arms. Raphael, my husband of 8 years who was preparing pancakes on the imported electric griddle we had purchased to make special breakfasts on weekends, dropped the silicone spatula he was holding, the utensil hitting the porcelain tile floor with a dry sound that echoed through the sudden silence that had taken over the kitchen. His expression went through a sequence of emotions that I could read perfectly after years of marriage. Initial confusion, processing the absurd words our son had pronounced, gradual understanding of the magnitude of the accusation, and finally, an absolute horror that perfectly mirrored what I was feeling as my legs trembled so much that I needed to lean on the granite countertop to avoid completely collapsing on the floor. "Pedro, my love, what exactly did Grandma Regina say to you?" I managed to articulate in a voice I didn't recognize as my own, a voice strangled by the combination of panic, disbelief, and a primitive anger that was beginning to bubble from the depths of my soul like volcanic lava about to erupt. My 3-year-old son, or was he really my son, continued chewing his cereal with the characteristic nonchalance of small children who don't understand when they've just detonated an emotional bomb of nuclear proportions in the middle of the family. "Grandma said that when I was born, she went to the baby place and picked me because I was prettier than the other baby, the baby you had in your tummy who was ugly and dark," Pedro replied with his childish voice, pronouncing words with the typical difficulty of children his age, but with enough clarity to confirm that there was no misunderstanding. That my mother had actually confessed to an innocent child that she had committed the most heinous crime a grandmother could perpetrate against her own daughter and grandson. The coffee cup I was holding slipped from my numb fingers and shattered on the floor, creating an explosion of white ceramic and dark liquid that spread around my bare feet. But I didn't feel the burn of the hot coffee on my skin, didn't register the pain of the shards cutting my feet, because all my capacity to process physical sensations had been completely overwhelmed by the emotional tsunami engulfing me. 3 years. 3 whole years creating, loving, protecting, sacrificing myself for a child that my mother had literally stolen from another woman because she considered his physical characteristics superior to those of my true biological son. Raphael crossed the kitchen in 2 long strides, ignoring the ceramic shards and the puddle of coffee, and hugged me tightly as I began to shake violently, my body going into simultaneous physical and emotional shock. "Gabriella, breathe, please. Breathe deeply. Let's understand what's happening. There must be some explanation, some misunderstanding," he whispered in my ear, but his own trembling voice betrayed the fact that he too was processing the terrifying possibility that the blonde, blue-eyed boy we had called son for 3 years might not share our DNA, might be a kidnapped child we had been unwittingly raising. "Raphael, call my mother now. Now!" I shouted, breaking free from his embrace and picking up Pedro with a sudden movement that startled him and made him start whimpering. I held his little face between my trembling hands, studying every feature, every detail, desperately looking for some resemblance to me or Raphael that could disprove Regina's monstrous confession. But there, under the natural light coming through the kitchen window, the differences I had always naively attributed to distant recessive genes became painfully obvious. The porcelain-like fair skin that contrasted with our Mediterranean tone, the golden blonde hair that no known relative possessed, the blue eyes that now seemed to silently accuse years of lies. "Mommy, you're hurting me," Pedro said with his frightened little voice, and I immediately loosened my grip, realizing I was holding his face too tightly in my frantic search for signs of biological connection. The boy I had rocked through countless nights of colic, whose first words I had obsessively recorded, whose first steps I had celebrated with tears of joy, this boy was now looking at me with fear, not understanding why his innocent revelation had transformed his loving mother into a desperate woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Raphael already had the phone to his ear, dialing Regina's number while I continued holding Pedro, torn between the impulse to hug him with all my might, because he was my son of 3 years of nurturing and unconditional love, and the horror of thinking that somewhere in this city there was another boy, my true biological son, calling another woman mother. "Regina, it's Raphael. You need to come here immediately." Pedro just told us something very serious about a conversation you had yesterday. I heard my husband say in a controlled voice that couldn't completely mask the underlying fury. The wait for the 20 minutes that Regina took to arrive at our house was a psychological torture that tested every limit of my mental sanity. Pedro, sensing that something very serious was happening, but not understanding his connection to the situation, had gone back to eating his cereal while watching cartoons on the tablet, occasionally looking at us with childish concern when he saw me silently crying, or Raphael pacing back and forth across the room like a caged animal. During those endless minutes, my mind obsessively revisited every moment of the past 3 years looking for signs I should have noticed. The nurses at the maternity ward commenting with surprise about the baby's fair complexion, but I was so exhausted after 36 hours of labor, followed by an emergency C-section, that I barely registered it. The constant comments from acquaintances about how Pedro didn't look like either parent, which we always answered with laughter about recessive genes. Regina's strange behavior in the first few months after birth, which I attributed to the excessive zeal of a first-time grandmother. Gabriela, whatever we discover, Pedro is our son, Raphael suddenly said, kneeling in front of me and holding my hands. 3 years of love don't disappear because of DNA. But if your mother really did what we're thinking, then there's another child out there, our biological child, living with a family that doesn't know they're raising the wrong baby. His words, intended to comfort me, only intensified my despair, because they confirmed the devastating dual reality. I was simultaneously mother to 2 children, one I raised with love but who was stolen, and another I never knew but who carried my blood. The doorbell rang with a shrill sound that made us all jump. Raphael went to answer while I remained seated, unable to trust my legs to support me. I heard the door opening, footsteps in the hallway, and then Regina entered the living room with her always haughty posture, dressed in an impeccable beige linen outfit, her gray hair perfectly combed as always, showing no sign of guilt or nervousness that would be expected from someone about to be confronted about a monstrous crime. "What is all this drama, Raphael? You called me as if it were a medical emergency," she said, with that condescending tone she always used when she considered we were overreacting about something. But when her green eyes, the same eyes I had inherited, met mine, something in my expression must have communicated the gravity of the situation, because her confident posture momentarily faltered. "Sit down, Mom," I said, my voice coming out surprisingly firm despite my internal chaos. "Pedro told us about a very interesting conversation you had yesterday. Something about him not being the baby I gave birth to. Something about you switching him at the maternity ward because he was more beautiful." Each word left my mouth like a bullet, fired with precision to hit the target. The silence that followed was deafening. Regina remained standing in the middle of the room, her face going through a series of micro-expressions that years of living together allowed me to decipher. Surprise at being discovered, calculation about what to say, an attempt to formulate a denial, and finally, devastatingly, resignation. She slowly sat on the sofa, adjusting her skirt with mechanical movements, while clearly buying time to decide her strategy. "Gabriela, dear, you know how children that age have fertile imaginations. Pedro must have misunderstood some story I was telling," she began, but her voice lacked the conviction necessary to sustain the lie. Her eyes couldn't meet mine, fixed on a point on the wall behind me, and her hands trembled slightly, while compulsively smoothing the fabric of her skirt. "Don't insult my intelligence, Mother. Pedro was very specific. He said you took him because he was more beautiful than the dark-skinned baby I had. These aren't words a 3-year-old would invent on his own," I replied, standing up and walking until I stood in front of her, forcing her to face me. "Look me in the eyes and tell me the truth. Did you switch my baby at the maternity ward?" Regina finally raised her gaze, and what I saw in those green eyes chilled me to the bone. There was no remorse, just a kind of distorted pride mixed with irritation at having been discovered. "You've always been too dramatic, Gabriela. Yes, I made a choice 3 years ago. A mother's choice who wanted the best for her daughter. That baby you gave birth to was inadequate. Small, dark, with a crooked nose. Pedro was perfect. Blonde, with blue eyes. The child you deserved to raise." The sound that came from my throat wasn't human. It was a primal scream of pain, anger, and disbelief that made Pedro drop the tablet and run into Raphael's arms, frightened by the transformation of his normally calm and loving mother into a creature consumed by emotions he couldn't understand. Raphael also seemed in shock, his mouth open in disbelief as he processed the casual confession of a crime that instantly destroyed any concept of family normality. "You," You literally kidnapped a child? Stole my true son? Condemned another family to raise the wrong child because of appearance? I managed to articulate between sobs that now shook my entire body. How? How did you get into the nursery? How did you switch the bracelets? How did nobody notice? Regina sighed as if she were being forced to explain something tedious to a particularly obtuse child. It was ridiculously easy, dear. You were unconscious from the C-section. Raphael had gone home to get your things. The maternity ward was in chaos because of a multiple accident on the highway. The nursery had a single sleepy technician taking care of 15 babies. I waited for her to leave to get medications. Entered, there were no cameras at that time, cut the wristbands, switched them, and left. 3 minutes maximum. The naturalness with which she described having committed multiple federal crimes was psychopathic. There wasn't a trace of remorse in her voice, just a sick satisfaction with the efficiency of her criminal execution. Are you telling me that 3 years ago you decided on your own that my biological son wasn't good enough and simply exchanged him for another as if they were objects in a store? I did what any loving grandmother would do. I ensured that my daughter had the best baby available, Regina replied, crossing her arms defensively. You should thank me. Pedro is a beautiful, intelligent, healthy child. The other one. Well, he's probably better off with a family that has expectations more suitable to his characteristics. Raphael finally found his voice, and when he spoke, there was a controlled fury that I had rarely witnessed in him. Regina, do you realize that you committed kidnapping, document forgery, and destroyed 2 families? You're going to prison for this. And we're going to find our real son, Matthias, and we're going to deal with the consequences of your monstrous crime. The name of our biological son being pronounced out loud hit me like a physical blow. Matthias. The name we had chosen after months of discussion, which means gift from God, ironically appropriate considering the 5 years of fertility treatments that preceded his conception. Somewhere in this city, a 3-year-old child named Matthias answered to another name, being raised by people who didn't know they were living a lie orchestrated by my psychopathic mother. You are overreacting as always, Regina said, standing up with the clear intention of leaving. There is no proof of any of this. They're just words from a 3-year-old child and conspiracy theories from a hysterical daughter. No court would take this seriously after so much time. Get out of my house, I said, my voice low but loaded with an authority that surprised even me. Leave now and never come back. You are no longer a mother to me, no longer Pedro's grandmother, no longer anything. You are just a criminal who destroyed my life and that of an innocent family. Regina stopped at the door, turning one last time. One day you'll understand that I did this out of love, Gabriella. Everything I've ever done was to ensure the best for you, even when you couldn't see what was best. Her final words, loaded with a sick conviction that her crimes were justified, confirmed that she was incapable of comprehending the monstrosity of what she had done. After she left, the silence in the house was oppressive. Pedro looked at us with his big blue eyes that I now knew belonged to other biological parents somewhere. Without fully understanding what had happened but perceiving that something fundamental had changed. Raphael hugged me while I cried convulsively, my entire body shaken by sobs that came from the deepest place in my soul. We'll find Matthias, Raphael whispered, his own voice choked. We'll find our biological son. We'll understand this whole situation. And we'll make sure Regina pays for what she did. But Gabriella, look at me. He held my face between his hands, forcing me to face him. Pedro is our son in every way that matters. 3 years of love, of care, of memories. That doesn't disappear. We'll have to find a way to deal with this impossible situation, but we won't abandon Pedro. I knew he was right, but the internal conflict was devastating. How to simultaneously love the child I raised, but who was stolen from other parents, while desperately longing to meet the biological son I never had the chance to hold. How to process the fact that every precious memory of the last 3 years was built upon a monstrous crime. How to look at Pedro without thinking of Matthias. How to think of Matthias without feeling like I was betraying Pedro. The next hours passed in a blur of frantic phone calls. Raphael contacted a lawyer friend who guided us on the legal procedures. I called the maternity hospital where Pedro and Matthias were born, trying to obtain information about the births on that specific date. Each call was an emotional roller coaster of hope and frustration, as we tried to navigate hospital bureaucracy and people's disbelief when we explained the surreal situation. The pediatrician who had been following Pedro since birth, Dr. Martinez, was particularly helpful when we explained our suspicion. I always found the physical difference between Pedro and you strange, but I attributed it to genetics. If you want, I can request an urgent DNA test. With the results, you'll have legal grounds to investigate what really happened. The decision to do the DNA test was simultaneously obvious and agonizing. Part of me wanted to remain in ignorance, continue believing that Regina might be lying or delusional. But the rational part knew we needed the truth, however devastating it might be. Rafael collected Pedro's saliva samples while distracting him with a story about scientists studying superheroes, trying to keep the situation as non-traumatic as possible for a child who had no fault in the perpetrated crime. And what if we find Matthias and he's happy with his family? What if they're good people who love him as much as we love Pedro? How are we going to destroy their lives too? I asked, voicing the fear that consumed us. The situation had no villains besides Regina, only multiple victims of a crime that created an ethical problem with no perfect solution. One step at a time, Rafael replied, holding my hand. First, we confirm with DNA. Then we seek legal and psychological guidance. There are precedents for situations like this, however rare they may be. We'll find specialists. We'll do everything in the most careful and least traumatic way possible for all children involved. But even as he spoke rationally about next steps, I could see in his eyes the same terror that consumed me. How to explain to Pedro that he had other biological parents somewhere? How to explain to Matthias that the family he knew wasn't biologically his? How to live with the fact that my own mother had engineered this tragedy out of sick aesthetic vanity? The phone rang at 2 a.m, startling us. It was the lawyer Rafael had contacted earlier, Dr. Ferreira. Sorry to call so late, but I obtained some information through contacts. On the day you indicated, 7 boys were born at the maternity hospital. I got the names of 6 families. One moved away shortly after the birth. I'll send the details by email. I've also prepared the documentation to file a police report and start a formal investigation. 6 families. One of them was raising Matthias without knowing. One of them had lost Pedro and didn't even know. The email arrived minutes later, and with trembling hands, I opened the list. 6 names, 6 addresses, 6 families whose lives were about to be devastated by the revelation of Regina's crime. How to approach these people. How to explain without causing panic. How to discover which one had our son without traumatizing 5 innocent families. I spent the rest of the night obsessively studying the limited information available about each family. I searched for profiles on social networks, hoping for some sign, some photo that showed a 3-year-old child with characteristics that resembled ours. It was on a Facebook page of a woman named Carmem Santos that my heart stopped. A photo of a 3rd birthday party posted 2 months ago. A boy blowing out candles, dark brown hair like mine, tan skin like Raphael's, and mainly the same slightly crooked nose shape that I had as a child, before getting a rhinoplasty at 18. Raphael, I called with a trembling voice, showing him the notebook screen. I think I found Matthias. He came running from the kitchen, leaving the dinner dishes half done, and leaned over my shoulder to see the image that had frozen my breathing. The photograph showed a children's birthday party in a modest but well-kept yard, with colorful balloons, a table covered with a Spider-Man tablecloth, and in the center, blowing out 3 candles on a homemade chocolate cake, was a boy who was unquestionably our son. The dark brown hair had exactly the same shade and texture as mine, before I started lightening it with highlights. The light tan skin inherited from Raphael with that characteristic golden undertone of his family. The brown eyes with a slightly almond shape that I saw in the mirror every day, and especially the nose slightly crooked to the left, a genetic characteristic from my paternal family that I had surgically corrected at 18, but that reappeared in each generation. My God, Gabriella. It's him. It's Matthias, Raphael whispered, his voice breaking with emotion as his hands squeezed my shoulders. I could feel his body trembling behind me, the same tremor that shook my own body as we continued to stare, hypnotized at the screen, devouring every pixel of that image, showing the son we had never held, never rocked to sleep, never seen take his first steps. Carmem Santos's Facebook page was configured with partial privacy, allowing me to see some public posts, but not all details. I managed to discover that she was a kindergarten teacher at a municipal school, married to a man named Roberto who worked as a mechanic, and they lived in a lower middle-class neighborhood approximately 40 minutes by car from our house. The few visible photos showed an apparently happy and united family. Besides Matthias, they had an older girl of approximately 7 years, clearly their biological daughter with the same physical characteristics as the parents. How are we going to approach this family? How are we going to tell them that the son they've loved for 3 years is not biologically theirs? I asked, closing the laptop because I couldn't look at those images anymore without feeling my heart breaking. Each photo of Mateus smiling in Carmen's arms, each documented moment of his childhood with that family, was simultaneously proof of Regina's crime and a painful reminder of everything we had lost. Raphael sat beside me on the sofa, taking my hands in his. First, we need to confirm with Pedro's DNA test. Then, we'll seek the best possible legal and psychological guidance. We can't just show up at their door and destroy their lives without a careful plan. His voice was firm, but I could see in his eyes the same agony that consumed me, the desperation to know our biological son fighting against the terror of traumatizing 2 innocent children. The DNA test result arrived 3 days later, in an ordinary white envelope that seemed inadequate to contain such devastating truth. My hands were shaking so much that Raphael had to open the envelope and read the document. He didn't need to say anything. His expression said it all. The test confirmed with 99.9% certainty that Pedro was not our biological son. We were officially parents of a child we didn't know and guardians of a child who belonged to others. Now it's official, Raphael said, placing the paper on the table as if it burned. Regina really switched the babies. Pedro is not our biological son. The words, even though expected, created a new and terrible reality that we could no longer deny or hope was a misunderstanding. Pedro was at school at that moment, fortunately unaware of the emotional earthquake that was destroying his family. We had a few hours to process the scientific confirmation before he returned home, a few hours to decide how to protect a 3-year-old from the devastating truth about his own identity while dealing with our own unbearable pain. We need to hire the best specialist possible, I said, picking up my phone to call Elena, my best friend since college and now a family law attorney. Child psychologists, family mediators, specialists in baby switching situations. We can't do this alone. Elena answered on the second ring, and I poured out the entire story in rushed words and intermittent sobs. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she responded with a professional but compassionate voice. Gabriela, I have no words, but I'll help you. I know a child psychologist specializing in complex traumas, Dr. Ana Carolina, who has handled cases of late adoption disclosure. And there are legal precedents, although rare. I'm coming over right now. While waiting for Elena to arrive, Raphael and I hugged on the sofa, silently crying for the loss of 3 years with our biological son and for the impossible future that awaited us. How to raise Pedro knowing he had other parents somewhere. How to meet Matthias without destroying the only family he had ever known. How to live with the fact that my own mother had engineered this tragedy. Elena arrived in less than 30 minutes, bringing with her a folder with documents and legal precedents she had quickly printed at her office. There are some documented cases of baby switches discovered years later, she explained, spreading papers on the coffee table. Most resulted in shared custody agreements and gradual rapprochement between the families. It's a long and painful process, but it's possible to minimize the trauma for the children. But these cases were accidental switches, Raphael observed, reading one of the documents. Our case involves deliberate crime. Regina committed kidnapping. That changes everything legally. Elena nodded gravely. Yes, the fact that it was intentional complicates things. Regina can be criminally prosecuted, which means police investigation, possible media coverage, and much more trauma for everyone involved. We need to think strategically about how to proceed. Dr. Ana Carolina arrived 2 hours later, a woman of approximately 50 years with a calming presence and eyes that conveyed experience in dealing with impossible situations. She listened to our whole story without interrupting, making only occasional notes in a brown leather notebook. The absolute priority must be the well-being of both children, she said when we finished explaining. Pedro and Mateus are completely innocent in this situation. Any solution needs to be implemented gradually and carefully to minimize trauma. She paused, choosing her words carefully. You need to understand that there is no perfect solution here. Any path you choose will result in some level of suffering for everyone involved. How do we tell Pedro? I asked, my voice almost a whisper. How do we explain to a 3-year-old that the grandmother he adores committed a horrible crime, that he has other biological parents somewhere, but that he's still our son and will always love him? We don't tell everything at once, Dr. Ana Carolina answered. At that age, children cannot process complex concepts like biological versus emotional identity. We start with small, age-appropriate truths, gradually building a narrative that he can understand as he grows. What about Matthias and his family? Raphael asked. How do we approach the Santos without completely destroying their lives? The psychologist sighed deeply. That's the most delicate part. Ideally, you would make contact through professional intermediaries, perhaps a specialized social worker. The revelation needs to be made in a controlled environment, with immediate psychological support available. And we need to be prepared for any reaction. Denial, anger, fear, even refusal to believe. We decided that the first step would be for Elena to contact a family law attorney who could represent our interests while protecting the rights of all children involved. Dr. Marcelo Fernandez had 20 years of experience in complex custody cases and had dealt with situations of late paternity revelation, though never with a case of criminal baby switching. My recommendation is to document absolutely everything before making any contact with the other family. Dr. Fernandez advised us during our first meeting in his austere office downtown. We need Pedro's DNA test. We need to locate and confirm Matthias's identity through hospital records. And most importantly, we need to ensure that Regina cannot interfere with or manipulate the situation. Regina is under house arrest awaiting trial, Raphael informed. We got a restraining order after the confession, but she's still been trying to contact us through other family members. We'll reinforce that restraining order and include specific prohibition of contact with the children or the Santos family, the lawyer said, making notes. The last thing we need is her attempting some kind of interference or emotional blackmail. The next days were consumed by legal and emotional preparations. We hired a complete team. Beyond the lawyers and child psychologist, we brought in a social worker specialized in family reunification and a professional mediator to eventually facilitate the first contact with the Santos family. Mommy, why are you sad? Pedro asked one night as I tucked him into bed, his blue eyes studying me with that frightening perception that small children sometimes demonstrate. Mommy is a little worried about some grown-up things, my love. But it's nothing to do with you, I answered, kissing his forehead and fighting back tears. You know that Mommy and Daddy love you very much, don't you? Yes, more than all the stars in the sky, he replied, repeating the phrase I had said to him every night since he was a baby. The painful irony that I had said these words thinking he was my biological son, and discovering that love had transcended biology, hit me with renewed force. 2 weeks after the DNA test confirmation, we were finally ready for the next step, officially confirming through hospital records and genetic tests that Matthias Santos was our biological son. Dr. Fernandez had obtained a confidential court order that allowed us to access the hospital birth records without prematurely alerting the Santos family. The records confirmed our suspicions. Matthias Santos had been born on exactly the same day and time that appeared on Pedro's birth certificate. The footprint records that the hospital kept archived did not match Pedro's current footprints, further proof of Regina's crime. The head nurse who had worked that night, Sonia Almeida, still worked at the hospital and agreed to provide testimony. I remember that night, Sonia told us, her tired eyes revealing 2 decades of work in maternity care. It was chaotic. A serious accident on the highway brought many emergencies. We were working with half the normal staff. Mrs. Regina was always around, very helpful, assisting with the babies while the mothers rested. We never suspected. My God, how did we not notice? The guilt in her voice was palpable, but there was no way to blame the overworked team. Regina had chosen the perfect moment, exploited the chaos, and executed her crime with psychopathic precision. With all evidence gathered and documented, the moment we had feared and postponed arrived, making contact with the Santos family. We decided that the approach would be made through the social worker, Marina Rodriguez, who had experience in family reunification and delicate revelations. I'll schedule a visit with them under the pretext of a routine survey about families with young children, Marina explained during our strategy meeting. During the visit, I'll evaluate the family dynamics, the environment, and especially the bond between Matthias and his parents. Afterward, we'll schedule a formal meeting for the revelation, with all necessary support present. The wait for the results of this first visit was agonizing. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, just kept imagining my biological son living his normal life, unaware that his existence was about to be turned upside down because of my mother's crime. Marina returned 2 days later with a detailed report and a somber expression. The Santos family is... They're good people, Gabriela. Carmem is a dedicated mother. Roberto is a present and loving father. Matthias is a happy child, well-adjusted, clearly loved. The older daughter, Sophia, adores her brother. They're a functional and loving family. Each word was simultaneously comforting and devastating. Comforting to know that our biological son had been loved and well cared for. Devastating to know that we were going to destroy this harmonious family with our revelation. How was Matthias? What is he like? I asked, hungry for any detail about the son I never knew. Marina smiled softly. He's a lovely child, very verbal for his age, loves dinosaurs, has an impressive vocabulary. Carmen mentioned that he's always been advanced for his age, started walking at 10 months, spoke his first words at 8 months. She paused. He has the same way of tilting his head when he's thinking that you do, Gabriella, and the same crooked smile as Raphael. I began to cry uncontrollably. 3 years of developmental milestones lost, 3 years of first words, first steps, first laughs, all experienced by another woman who had no idea she was raising my son. When are we going to tell them? Raphael asked, his voice tense with contained emotion. Dr. Fernandez is preparing all the legal documentation. Dr. Ana Carolina is setting up a psychological support protocol for both families. I suggest we make the revelation next week, on Thursday, in a neutral environment, perhaps in Dr. Fernandez's office, which has a comfortable meeting room, Marina suggested. The date was set, Thursday, September 15th at 2:00 p.m. The Santos family would be invited to a meeting about an important issue related to Matthias's birth records. Vague enough not to cause premature panic, specific enough to ensure they would attend. The days preceding the meeting were a blur of anxiety and preparation. Pedro remained oblivious to the approaching storm, happy in his 3-year-old routine. I watched him play, memorizing every detail, terrified that we might lose him somehow, despite all legal guarantees that he would remain with us. No matter what happens, Raphael told me the night before the meeting, Pedro is our son in all the ways that matter. 3 years of love don't disappear. And we'll get to know Matthias. We'll be part of his life somehow. We'll find a way to make this work. But even with all the planning, all the psychological preparation, all the professional support, nothing could have adequately prepared us for the moment of looking into Carmen and Roberto Santos's eyes and saying the words that would destroy their world. There's something about Matthias you need to know. The meeting room in Dr. Fernandez's office was prepared with chairs arranged in a circle, an attempt to create a less confrontational environment for the most devastating moment two families could face. At 1:45 p.m. that Thursday in September, Raphael and I were already positioned, our hands intertwined in a desperate attempt to give each other strength. Marina, the social worker, was checking the documents one last time. Dr. Ana Carolina reviewed her notes on trauma disclosure protocol. Dr. Fernandez checked the legal documents that would prove our impossible story. At 1:58 p.m., we heard voices in the hallway. My heart started beating so hard I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. The door opened and Carmen and Roberto Santos entered, clearly confused but trying to maintain composure. Carmen was a woman of approximately 35, brown hair tied in a practical bun, wearing a simple blouse and jeans. Clearly she had left work in a hurry. Roberto, a few years older, wore a mechanic's uniform, with his name embroidered on the pocket, his hands still showing traces of grease despite his evident attempt to clean them. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Santos," Dr. Fernandez began, his voice professional but gentle. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down." I know the invitation was vague, but we needed to discuss something extremely important about Matthias in person. I saw Carmen instinctively squeeze her husband's hand upon hearing their son's name. Our son. "Is Matthias okay? Did something happen?" she asked, the immediate maternal concern in her voice hitting me like a blade. "Matthias is physically fine," Marina quickly intervened. "But we've discovered information about the circumstances of his birth that needs to be shared with you." The silence that followed was as dense as lead. Dr. Fernandez cleared his throat and began the explanation we had rehearsed dozens of times, but which still sounded surreal. 3 years ago, at San Lucas Maternity Hospital, there was a criminal incident. 2 babies born on the same day were deliberately switched by a third person. One of those babies was Matthias. Carmen's face lost all color. Roberto leaned forward as if he hadn't heard correctly. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief. It was my turn to speak, although my voice shook so much I barely recognized myself. "My name is Gabriella. This is my husband, Raphael. 3 years ago, I gave birth to a boy at the same hospital, on the same day you did. My mother, Regina, criminally switched the babies in the nursery. You're raising my biological son, and I've been raising yours." The scream that came from Carmen was primitive, visceral, the sound of a mother confronted with her worst nightmare. She stood up abruptly, the chair falling backward. "No, that's a lie. Matthias is my son. I gave birth to him. I breastfed him. Her words dissolved into sobs as Roberto embraced her, his own face a mask of shock and denial. We have proof, Dr. Fernandez said gently, opening the folder with the documents. DNA tests of Pedro, the boy Mrs. Gabriela is raising, confirm he's not biologically her son. Hospital records show inconsistencies in the footprints. And most importantly, Mrs. Regina confessed to the crime and is currently under house arrest awaiting trial. The next 2 hours were a blur of tears, screams, denial, and gradual forced acceptance of an impossible reality. Carmen alternated between fury, how could anyone do this? How could anyone steal a baby? And despair. Matthias won't understand. He'll think we don't love him. He's my baby, my baby. Roberto, after the initial shock, became practically catatonic, staring fixedly at the photographs we had brought of Pedro. It was impossible not to see the resemblance. Pedro had Roberto's same blue eyes, Carmen's same face shape. 3 years, he murmured repeatedly. 3 years raising the wrong son. Doctor. Ana Carolina took control of the situation when emotions threatened to completely overflow. I know this is devastating for everyone, but we need to think about the children's well-being. Pedro and Matthias are too young to understand complex concepts like biological parenthood. Any decision we make needs to be gradual and careful. Decision? Carmen asked hoarsely. What decision? Are you going to take Matthias from me? No. Rafael spoke for the first time, his voice steady despite the tears. Nobody is going to take anyone from anyone. We need to find a solution that works for both children. They are foster siblings in a way. They've been loved for 3 years. This can't simply be erased. Marina then presented the plan we had developed with the team of specialists. The recommendation is to start with supervised meetings in a neutral environment. The children would be introduced as new little friends. Gradually, as they get used to each other and to the families, we increase the frequency and duration of the meetings. And then? Roberto asked, finally finding his voice. After that, you'll take Pedro and we'll stay with Matthias and pretend 3 years never happened? No, I said, standing up and walking until I was facing them. After that, we find a way to be an extended, complicated family. Because I will never be able to simply hand Pedro over to you and take Matthias in exchange as if they were objects. And I imagine you feel the same way. Carmen stared at me through her tears, and for a moment, 2 mothers recognized each other in their shared pain. How do we do this? How do we explain to a 3-year-old child that mommy and daddy aren't mommy and daddy? We don't, Dr. Ana Carolina answered. Not immediately. We build a new narrative gradually. The children will have 2 families who love them. Over time, as they grow, we'll introduce the truth in pieces they can process. The first meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later at a public park with a playground. The preparation time was agonizing. How could I prepare Pedro to meet his biological parents without traumatizing him? How could I prepare myself to see my biological son call another woman mom? I spent hours observing Pedro, memorizing every detail, terrified that he might somehow be torn from me despite all legal guarantees. He noticed my anxiety with that frightening perception children have. Mommy sad? He constantly asked, hugging me with his small arms. Rafael and I decided to be honest within what was age appropriate. Mommy and Daddy found out that you have other special friends to meet. It's a very cool surprise. The day of the meeting dawned sunny, as if the universe were mocking the emotional storm that would unfold. We arrived at the park first, Pedro immediately running to the swings, oblivious to the magnitude of the moment. I was strategically positioned where I could see the park entrance. At 10:07 they arrived. My first glimpse of Matthias in person was like taking a punch to the stomach. He was getting out of the car holding Carmen's hand, wearing a Rex Dinosaur t-shirt, shoes that lit up with each step. But it was the details that destroyed me. The way he tilted his head when observing something new, exactly as I did. The way he held Carmen's hand, with his pinky extended like Rafael always did. My son, my baby I never knew. Carmen saw me the same instant I saw her. Our eyes met across the park, and the mutual recognition of pain was palpable. She then looked at Pedro on the swings, and I saw her entire body shudder as she recognized the characteristics of the biological son she never raised. Marina, who was coordinating the meeting, motioned for them to approach. Let's do this naturally, she had instructed. Let the children interact organically. Pedro, I called, my voice surprisingly steady. Come meet some new friends. Pedro jumped off the swing and ran to us, stopping curiously when he saw the other boy. Mateus, more shy, partially hid behind Carmen's legs, but peeked out with curiosity. "Hi," Pedro said cheerfully. "I'm Pedro. Do you want to play?" "I'm Mateus," the little voice replied, and my heart broke into 1,000 pieces, hearing my biological son's voice for the first time. "Do you like dinosaurs?" "I love dinosaurs," Pedro replied enthusiastically. "Come on, let's go to the slide." For the next hour, the two families maintained an awkward dance of observation and forced interaction. Roberto and Rafael tried to talk about soccer, but their eyes constantly returned to the boys. Carmen and I couldn't exchange many words beyond observations about the weather and how well the boys were getting along. But it was when the small accident happened that everything changed. Matthias fell from the jungle gym, scraping his knee. Instinctively, I stood up to run to him. The maternal impulse of 3 years of loving Pedro automatically transferring to the child who shared my DNA. But I forced myself to stop, watching Carmen run to him, comfort him, kiss the wound. "It hurts, Mommy," Matthias cried, and every cell in my body screamed that I should be the mommy comforting him. Pedro, showing surprising empathy for his age, ran to them. "Don't cry, look. I have Spider-Man Band-Aids." He took out one of the bandages I always carried for emergencies. Carmen looked at me as Pedro gently helped put the bandage on Mateus's knee. Our eyes met, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between us. Our biological children had been raised with love and care, transformed into gentle and empathetic children. The meetings continued weekly, then bi-weekly. Gradually, the children developed a genuine friendship. Peter, more extroverted, would pull Matthew into adventures. Matthew, more cautious, would temper Peter's enthusiasm with caution. They complemented each other in a way that would be beautiful if it weren't so tragically ironic. After 2 months of meetings at the park, we decided to try something more intimate. Lunch at the Santoses' home. The decision was agonizing. Entering the house where my biological son lived, seeing his room, his toys, the life he had without me. The Santoses' house was modest but cozy, on a tree-lined street in a middle-class neighborhood. As soon as we entered, Peter ran straight to a shelf full of toy dinosaurs. "Wow, Matthew, you have the giant T-Rex. Want to see my room?" Matthew asked shyly. "I have more dinosaurs there." While the boys went upstairs, accompanied by Marina, the two families remained in the living room, the uncomfortable silence filled only by the distant sound of children playing. It was Carmen who broke the silence. "He likes to draw," she said softly, handing me a notebook. "He started very early, even before he could hold a pencil properly. Roberto says it's natural talent, but..." She paused, looking at me meaningfully. I opened the notebook with trembling hands. Matthew's drawings, even for a 3-year-old, showed an unusual spatial perception, an intuitive understanding of perspective that I recognized immediately. It was the same ability that led me to architecture. "Does Peter draw too?" I asked, though I knew the answer. Peter had many talents, but art wasn't one of them. "No," Roberto answered, "but he loves building things. Lego, blocks, anything. And he's incredibly good with his hands for his age. Like you," I thought, observing Roberto's hands calloused from mechanical work. Lunch was surreal. Two families pretending normalcy while processing the impossible reality of raising each other's biological children. Matthew naturally sat beside me at the table, and I had to fight the urge to cut his food, to clean his face, to do all the things a mother would do. It was during dessert that Peter asked the question we all feared. "Mom, why do we come to see Matthew so much? Is he going to live with us?" The silence was deafening. The two children looked at us with innocent curiosity, waiting for an answer to a simple question that had the most complicated answer in the world. "Peter," I began carefully, "Matthew is a very special friend, and sometimes special friends become like family." "Like cousins?" Peter asked. "Yes," Rafael answered quickly. "Like cousins." Matthew looked at his parents. "Peter is my cousin?" Carmen visibly swallowed before answering. "He is. He's special like a cousin, yes." That night, after returning home and putting Peter to bed, Rafael and I stayed up late discussing the impossible future that awaited us. "I can't take this anymore," I confessed. Seeing Matthew and not being able to be his mother. Seeing Peter with them and knowing that biologically he belongs to that family. "But you are his mother," Rafael said firmly. "You've been Peter's mother for 3 years, and Carmen has been Matthew's mother for 3 years. Biology doesn't erase that." "So what do we do? Continue this charade forever? I don't know, he admitted. But I know we can't traumatize two innocent children because of your mother's crime. The mention of Regina brought a wave of anger that I struggled to control. She had been tried and sentenced to 5 years of house arrest, a sentence many considered too light for the magnitude of the crime. I hadn't spoken to her since the revelation, despite her multiple attempts to contact me. 3 months after the first meeting, we had an unexpected development. The children, with that simple wisdom they sometimes demonstrate, created their own solution. "Mom," Peter said one day, "I wish Matthew could live here with us, but he can also live at his house. Can we have 2 houses?" The innocence of the suggestion hit a solution that adults had been too complicated to see. At the next meeting with the entire support team, Carmen made a proposal that would change everything. What if? What if we didn't try to undo what was done? What if, instead, we expanded? "What do you mean?" I asked. "The children love each other. That's clear. They see each other as best friends, almost brothers. What if we raised them knowing they have 2 families, not exchanging one for the other, but having both?" Roberto supported his wife. "It would be unconventional, but this whole situation is already impossible. Why not try an impossible solution?" Dr. Ana Carolina considered, "There are precedents for functional expanded families. It would require a lot of work, a lot of therapy, a lot of communication, but it could minimize the trauma for the children." And thus began the strangest and most wonderful arrangement. We established a routine where the children spent alternate weekends at each other's homes, not as visitors, but as family members. Pedro had a room in the Santos's house. Matthias had a room in our house. The first overnight stays were agonizing. The first time Matthias slept in our house, I spent the entire night by his bed, watching him sleep, memorizing each breath of the son I should have raised from birth. When he woke up in the middle of the night calling, "Mommy," I had to physically restrain myself from responding, watching Rafael gently calm him and explain that Mommy Carmen was at his house, but that he was safe with us. Gradually, we developed our own language for our impossible situation. The children had Mommy Gabi and Daddy Rafa, and Mommy Carmen and Daddy Roberto. We had House 1 and House 2. We were the big family. 6 months after the first meeting, the moment I simultaneously feared and desired happened. Matthias, after falling and scraping his knee during one of his stays with us, came running to me crying, "Mommy Gabi Owie." I picked him up, kissed the wound, and for the first time in 6 months, I could be a mother to my biological son without guilt or hesitation. He nestled in my arms, and for a moment, the universe made sense again. But reality always returned. Like when Pedro drew a family tree at school and the teacher was completely confused by the 4 parents. Or when Matthias asked why he didn't come out of Mommy Gabi's tummy if she was his mother too. The moment of partial truth came when the boys were 4 years old. Too old to remain completely in the dark, too young for the complete truth. We gathered both families and, with Dr. Ana Carolina's guidance, explained, "When you were born, there was a mix-up at the hospital. Pedro went home with Mommy Gabi and Daddy Rafa, and Matthias went home with Mommy Carmen and Daddy Roberto. But you know what? This means you two are extra special, because you have 2 families who love you very much." Pedro processed the information with his typical cheerful acceptance. "So we're real brothers?" "In a way, yes," Rafael answered. Matthias, always more contemplative, asked, "But who's my real mom?" It was Carmen who answered, with tears in her eyes. "We both are your real mothers. I've taken care of you for 4 years, and Mommy Gabi has always loved you even before she met you." The adaptation wasn't perfect. There were moments of jealousy when Pedro seemed to prefer Carmen for certain things. There were nights when Matthias cried wanting to return to his real home when he was with us. There were arguments among the adults about parenting decisions, differences in values, boundaries, and rules. But there were also moments of unexpected beauty, like when Pedro defended Matthias from bullies at school, fiercely declaring that "nobody messes with my brother," or when Matthias made 2 identical Mother's Day cards, one for each mother, carefully writing "I love you" with his shaky child's handwriting. Regina tried to contact us several times from her home confinement. Letters arrived regularly, all returned unopened. She tried to use relatives as intermediaries, all refused, until 2 years after the revelation she showed up at our door, having violated the terms of her house arrest. "Gabriela, please," she begged when I opened the door. She was visibly aged, the weight of her crimes finally apparent on her face. "At least let me see the children. I'm their grandmother, both of them." "You are nothing to them," I responded coldly. You destroyed 2 families out of vanity. The children don't even know you exist. And that's how it will remain. I did it for you, she protested. So you would have the best child. You did it for yourself, I corrected. For your distorted vision of what's best. Pedro and Matthias are both perfect, both loved. Your inability to see that cost years of their lives with their true families. The police took her away that day, and she received additional time for violating house arrest. It was the last time I saw her. When the boys turned 5, we had a joint party. 2 families, dozens of friends confused about the dynamics. 2 cakes, a dinosaur one for Matthias, a superhero one for Pedro. During the party, I watched the children playing. Pedro was leading a group in some imaginary adventure, while Matthias was carefully building a tower of blocks. Carmen approached me. You know, she said softly, sometimes I forget which is which. I looked at her surprised. Not biologically, she clarified, but in my heart. I love them both equally now. Pedro is as much my son as Matthias, and I see how you look at Matthias. He's yours too. She was right. At some point in the last 2 years, the lines had blurred. We were no longer 2 families raising the wrong children. We were a strange, expanded family raising 2 boys who had the misfortune and the luck of being switched at birth. How will we explain everything to them when they're older? I asked. About Regina? About the crime? With the truth, Carmen answered. That something terrible happened, but from it came something beautiful. That they have more love than most children could dream of. Roberto and Rafael joined us, watching the boys. We're quite a strange family, Roberto commented. The strangest, Rafael agreed. But it works, and it did work, in its imperfect, complicated way. We had synchronized calendars, WhatsApp groups, family meetings that needed spreadsheets to organize. We had 2 of everything. 2 Christmas celebrations, 2 birthdays for each child, 2 houses that were home. One day when Pedro was 6, he asked me, Mom, why did Grandma Regina do that? Why did she switch us? The time had come for more truth. Grandma Regina was very sick in the head, I carefully explained. She thought appearance was more important than love. She was wrong. Was she bad? Matthias asked, having overheard the conversation. She did a very bad thing, I replied. But because of it, you both have something special. 2 families, 4 parents who love you more than anything. Pedro thought for a moment, then said with the simple wisdom of a child, So something bad turned into something good? Exactly, said Carmen, who had approached. Something very bad turned into something different, but good. The years passed. The boys grew up knowing their unique story, processing it in layers as they matured. There was therapy, a lot of therapy. There were moments of anger, especially in adolescence. When Matthias went through a phase of wanting to live only with us, his biological parents, and Pedro rebelled against the whole arrangement. But we survived. More than that, we thrived. Today, Pedro is 16, tall and athletic like Roberto, with Carmen's sense of humor and my stubbornness. He wants to be an engineer, combining his love for building things with the analytical mind he inherited from his biological parents. Matthias, also 16, is quiet and artistic like me, with Rafael's patience and the Santos's gentleness. He wants to be an architect, following steps that were biologically his from the beginning. They are brothers in all the ways that matter. They fight, compete, fiercely protect each other. When Pedro had his first heartbreak, it was Matthias who consoled him. When Matthias was bullied for being the kid with 4 parents, Pedro confronted the bullies without hesitation. Regina died 2 years ago in prison, alone. I was notified as the closest relative. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't tell the boys immediately either. When I finally told them, Pedro said, "She lost everything because of prejudice. What a waste." He was right. Regina had lost everything, her daughter, her grandchildren, her freedom, for believing that a blonde, blue-eyed baby was superior to a dark-skinned one. Her distorted vision had caused unimaginable pain, but inadvertently created something unique. You know, Matthias said recently during a dinner with both families, "We're probably the strangest family in the world." Definitely, Pedro agreed, but also the best. Carmen and I exchanged glances across the table, a silent understanding between 2 women who had been forced to redefine motherhood. Roberto and Rafael were discussing soccer, as they always did, comfortable in their forced brotherhood that had become genuine. It wasn't the family any of us had planned. It was a family born from crime, nurtured by necessity, and solidified by love. It was complicated, sometimes painful, always unconventional, but it was ours. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about how it might have been. If Regina hadn't committed her monstrous crime, if I had raised Matthias from birth, seen his first smile, heard his first words. If Pedro had grown up with his biological parents, become who he was naturally meant to be. But then I look at what we have. 2 incredible children who have more love than they could need. 2 families united by impossible circumstances but bound by choice. A redefinition of what family means. And I realize that Regina, in her criminal madness, inadvertently gave us a gift. Not the gift she intended, a more beautiful son, but the gift of realizing that family isn't about blood or appearance or what's normal. It's about love, commitment, and the daily choice to do what's best for the children. Even when it's hard, even when it's strange, even when the world doesn't understand. Pedro and Matthias aren't the children we were supposed to have raised. These are the children we raised, who we love, who became ours through circumstances that no one would choose but that we all chose to embrace. Recently, a reporter wanted to do a story about our family. A story of overcoming, she called it. We refused. Our story is not for public consumption, to be transformed into cheap inspiration or morbid curiosity. It's our story. Complicated, painful, beautiful, and absolutely ours. Pedro is applying to universities now. He wrote about our family in his admission essay. I read it crying when he showed me. I have 4 parents. Not through divorce or remarriage, but because I was born in one family and raised in another due to a crime. Some would say I'm a victim. I say I'm blessed. While most people have to choose between nature and nurture, I had both, doubled. I am who I am not, despite my impossible history, but because of it. Each parent gave me something unique: strength, humor, creativity, determination. I am the sum of 4 people who chose to love me even when biology said I belonged to others. Matthias, always more reserved, approached it differently. Architecture is about taking materials that don't necessarily belong together and creating something functional and beautiful. My family is like that. Pieces that shouldn't fit but were joined by necessity and cemented by love. I want to build buildings that challenge conventions in the same way my family challenges definitions. Both were accepted to their first choice universities. On the day Pedro received his acceptance letter, both families celebrated together. As we toasted with champagne, juice for the boys, Regina was mentioned for the first time in years. You know, said Roberto, slightly drunk. In a twisted way, we owe all of this to her. Uncomfortable silence. Not the crime, he quickly clarified. But look at us. Look at these boys. Would we have this if not for what happened? No, I admitted. But the price was too high. It was, Carmen agreed. But it's been paid. Now we have this. She gestured to all of us. And this is amazing. Pedro raised his juice glass. To the strangest family in the world. To the strangest family in the world. We all repeated. Matthias quietly added, and to Grandma Regina, who even though she was bad, unintentionally gave us to each other. It was the closest thing to forgiveness Regina would ever receive. It didn't absolve her crimes, didn't diminish the pain she caused, but it acknowledged that, from the ashes of her monstrosity, we had built something beautiful. As the boys prepared to leave home for university, I reflect on our journey. 16 years since that fateful afternoon when Regina confessed her crime. 16 years of navigating uncharted waters of an impossible family dynamic. They are resilient in a way normal teenagers aren't. They're empathetic beyond their years. They understand that love is not finite, that it can expand to accommodate however many people need it. Carmen and I have become more than co-mothers. We are sisters in a way that transcends any traditional definition. We share the children, the worries, the joys. When Pedro broke his arm at 10, Carmen was with me at the hospital. When Matthias had his first art show, all 4 parents were in the front row. Roberto and Rafael became the best friends neither expected to have in middle age. They have their own tradition of monthly fishing trips, taking the boys when they were younger, now going alone to talk about life, work, and the shared pride in their unique sons. Our story doesn't have the ending anyone would expect. There was no dramatic revelation moment where the children chose their true families. There was no court battle over custody. There was no traditional happy ending because our story isn't traditional. Instead, we have this: 2 homes where 2 boys are equally welcome. 4 parents who share the responsibility and joy of raising 2 extraordinary young men, and a redefinition of what family can be when love is greater than convention. Regina died believing she had made the right choice for wrong reasons. She never understood that Pedro and Mateus were both perfect as they were, that there was no better child. Her limited and prejudiced vision caused immeasurable pain, but also, inadvertently, created a family that defies all limitations. As I help Pedro pack for university, he suddenly stops and hugs me. "Thank you, Mom," he says, now taller than me. "For what?" I ask. "For not giving up when you discovered the truth. For finding a way to make it work. For giving me Matthias as a brother and Carmen and Roberto as extra parents." I hug him back. This son I did not bear but raised. This boy who became mine through a crime but remained mine through choice. "I'm the one who should thank you," I reply. "For you and Matthias teaching us that family is much bigger than we thought." Across town, I know a similar scene is happening between Carmen and Matthias. 2 boys preparing to leave the nest. Or rather, the nests. 2 families preparing for the next phase of a journey no one could have predicted. Regina's crime was unforgivable. The damage she caused, immeasurable. But what we built from the wreckage, that is our triumph. Pedro and Matthias leave for university next week. Different cities, different paths, but carrying with them the same extraordinary story. They promise to call each other every Sunday, maintaining the tradition of brotherhood that was forced upon them, but which they chose to embrace. You know what the best part is? Matthias told me yesterday, as we looked through old photo albums. When people ask about my family and I say which part, the confusion on their faces is priceless. We laughed together, mother and son, connected not just by DNA but by 16 years of building something unique from impossible circumstances. This is our story. It's not a story about switched babies, although it began that way. It's not a story about crime and punishment, although that's part of it. It's a story about redefining family, about choosing love over convention, about creating beauty from chaos. Regina was buried in a municipal cemetery, without an elaborate headstone, without a flowery epitaph. If I were to write one, it would say, "Here lies Regina, who in her quest for perfection, failed to see the perfection that already existed. Her crime created a family she could never have imagined or understood. But Regina doesn't deserve even that. She remains unmarked, unmemorialized, while the life she tried to control flourished in directions she could never have predicted. Regina's crime created a rupture that can never be fully repaired. We lost 3 precious years with our biological children. The children grew up with a reality they had to process and reprocess at each developmental stage. But we also gained something. An understanding that family is not defined by blood or law or convention. It is defined by choice, by love, by the daily decision to do what is best for the children, even when it is difficult. Not, "Did you like Gabriella's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's one more story waiting for you here on screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you."